in this that his colleagues at Notre Dame found it quite unimpressive. They surely would be the kind of people who should find it impressive. So that Kant doesn't find it particularly impressive if he knows about it.
Yeah.
And there's no evidence of that.
So you think it's nothing to do with Kant's later critical philosophy that would make it okay to say that, in some sense, the natures are being thwarted here? It's just that he thinks the whole argument isn't that impressive. Or
I don't think he knows anything about the argument. You don't get that argument in Leibniz. You have to read Suarez, and there's no evidence that, or somebody else. It's definitely in Suarez. There's no evidence that Kant read Suarez.
So you're interpolating your thought when you say, I think Kant would be unimpressed here, just because you find it unimpressive.
Well, I have actually, after thinking about it for a while, I find it quite an elegant argument, but at the beginning I certainly found it unimpressive.
Okay, thanks.
All right, Bob?
This is by way of philosophical reflection on the dialectical situation. In a way, it strikes me as not that difficult to think of intermediate positions between conservation and, at any rate, the most extreme interpretation of concurrence, which it's not clear to me is all that different from occasionalism, though Malebranche doesn't want to talk in terms of concurrence. I have a feeling that I'm worried about this whole debate as involved in word games, the key words in question being words that end in ism, which I think are always suspect because they tend to cover packages of things that are tied together in ways that one doesn't always understand in using the word, and in ways that packaging could be undone. And particularly with concurrentism. Now, just the example that we were just presented with, the electricity, the flow of electricity to various outlets and wires in this room does not cause the existence of this microphone or the loudspeakers or anything like that. It does, in some obvious sense, cause the operation of the microphone, but it doesn't determine what sounds are being transmitted through the microphone. I'm determining that at the moment, and others of you determine it at other times. Yeah. And so it seems easy enough to conceive of God directly and voluntarily causing not only the existence of some creature, but something that it needs for its operation, indeed causing it to be operating at the time, but without determining everything about the operation. And and no doubt there would be various forms of that. And it seems to me that theologians who have talked about concurrence have generally stopped being explicit at about that point as to just what they're talking about. It seems, I think there have been some theologians, even some great ones, who have really believed and meant to assert that absolutely everything that exists and everything that happens and everything that's true about it is that way because God decided that it should be that way. Perhaps some of the Islamic Asherite theologians believed that, perhaps Calvin, perhaps Schleiermacher, but most of these late medieval and early modern theologians who considered themselves concurrentists certainly did not believe that, at least as regards issues of free will. And as I was discussing on Friday, Malebranche didn't believe that.
Right.
And he's very explicit he doesn't believe that, and I think he's consistent in not believing that. But the problem, it seems to me, is figuring out exactly, if there is anything exactly what is meant by the concurrentist doctrine to see what's going on. And I mean, do you think that? It sort of looks as if Kant, because of the phenomenal noumenal thing, is going to back off from saying. He's going to say he doesn't know exactly what it is that God determines. Or do you think he does think God determines everything except free decisions? Or
yes. So actually, to say something about the first part of your point, I think it was brought out really nicely in your paper that occasionalism is such a complicated doctrine when you look closely at it, and the fact that it can allow for a certain kind of powers in creatures, even if they aren't true causes, you can get caught up in the labels of true cause, no true causes according to occasionalism. And when you just refuse to use those labels maybe and just try to ask what is the division of labor or something in more generic terms, it can seem as though maybe these positions aren't all that different, some of them, particularly the occasionalist position perhaps in concurrentism at times. I don't know about it seemed to be that you were more optimistic about the solution to the splitting the effect thing, that Fredosser presents this as one of the big problems for concurrence, and the idea is that if you're a concurrentist, you have to say, you're supposed to be committed to the view that the creature cannot do anything on its own, therefore you can't, on the one hand you want to say, concurred with God in bringing about the effect, but on the other hand, if you just isolate some identifiable part of it and say, creature alone, that's supposed to be bad because the creature can't do anything without divine concurrence. And so Durandus's argument is, of course, then God must, on this count, do half the half, half the half. Concurrentism collapses into occasionalism.
I guess I worry about creature alone in just the same way I worry about concurrence. There's one, look, I talked about electricity. There's nothing that any of us could do, so far as we know, for more than a minute or two without oxygen supply. So, if not being able to do anything without oxygen supply counts as not being able to do anything on our own, we're not able to do anything on our own. Without worrying about anything theological. So.
Maybe I'm influenced a bit here by Sukje. As you know, in working on an interpretation of Leibniz's theory of concurrence, he was trying to respond to Fredosser, who also seems somewhat optimistic about the possibility of coming up with a model that will address the no splitting of effect consideration. And part of Sukje's concern was that there is a splitting of effect going on. I noticed that Jeff McDonough's work now on Leibniz and concurrence is completely optimistic about solving this problem and the no splitting of effect problem. Maybe Sukje has convinced me over beers in the Anchor Bar that it's actually really, really hard to do. Maybe it isn't that hard, and we shouldn't be so pessimistic. That isn't, in any case, it's not clear that is Kant's argument against concurrence. Yeah. He has these bad conceptual arguments, right? And this was the disappointing part of this project for me. You always hope you'll find really great advance in Kant. In this case, you don't find anything really great, unfortunately.
Yeah, of course, Sukje's working on Leibniz, and Leibniz is one of the theologians about whom one has most reason to suspect that he thought that everything that's true is true because God decided it should be true, or because it's part of a complete system, all of which God decided should be true.
Mic on.
I didn't buy the advertising that it was going to be disappointing, at least when I got to the end. I thought it was great when it got to the end, and I love this last passage. So I guess part of my question is, why isn't this, you contrasted this, I guess, with Eric must have what you think of as a more optimistic interpretation, but this seemed very optimistic to me, because I take it that it's supposed to be an advantage of transcendental idealism that although we can't comprehend how these things go together, we don't have to worry about that, and we don't have to worry about any threat to theism by those who would argue that because you can't put these together, we should reject the whole package. So that passage under F seems like a wonderful advertisement for transcendental idealism to me.
So
But,
I agree with Suarez here. You know, I think as a philosopher, you're supposed to actually come up with a metaphysical model of how it works. So
Well-
Suarez mocks people who says, oh, some people say it all blends together in the goodness of God or something like that.
Well, okay,
You know,
but then that's the last...
Show me exactly how I can be a free agent.
Well, great, but then...
And how my acts can be fully dependent on God. And Kant appeals to a mystery. You know, so...
Right, but then
that's disappointing. Leibniz doesn't like appealing to mysteries. Leibniz is also like Suarez in that, where he wants to show how these two things that look like they can't be brought together can be brought together.
Well, great, but then my question is, why isn't the spirit of Kant very different than the spirit of Suarez as brought out by this last passage? That is, there are certain things that we can't put together, and in a certain respect, it's best that we can't put them together so we can mark them in the area where we can't put those things together, and there's no threat, say, to theism from people who would say, since you can't put that together, therefore God doesn't exist, or free will doesn't exist, or something along those lines. But I guess I have another package of questions that this raises for me that I've always wondered about what the constraints on coherence of our belief, of our rational beliefs about the supersensible really is. It seems pretty clear that Kant would regard it as a definite bummer if we had to believe things that, as far as we could see, were logically inconsistent. But beyond that, there's not much constraints on on coherence, is there? Because he himself is happy to say here in this passage that we can't see how these things are coherent, but we can rationally believe both of them. But then if that's true, then it might put limits on our ability to do the kind of elimination arguments you were interested in. That is, it can't be this view, it can't be this view, so it's got to be this view, because it seems like in principle we're not going to be able to rule out the possibility of other contenders like James and Bob were talking about.
Right. Thanks. On the issue of mere logical possibility, showing that this thing is consistent, in general in Kant's philosophy, he's not happy with that. You know, he's always distinguishing between what's really possible and what is merely conceptually possible. And as a metaphysician, he wants to say what is really possible might just be narrower than what is logically possible. So if you've shown something is logically possible, you haven't shown that it's possible, right? So that's one problem. The other problem is that to show that there's no contradiction involved, yes, at least that opens up the possibility that it might be really possible. And if there is a contradiction in it, of course, Kant's going to say it's not possible. But he seems to come very close in that passage to presenting it as almost contradictory. So what does he say about free action and divine dependency here? He says, we think of our action to be a creature and as a natural being merely the result of the will of the Creator, yet capable of responsibility as a freely acting being, but again, to consider one's own deed at the same time also as the effect of a higher being. So sometimes the way he puts it is, it seems to be we're forced to say it both is the effect of God, everything is the effect of God, and it isn't determined by God's predetermining providence. And therefore we seem to come quite close to a contradiction. That seems to be Kant's worry when he gets into this mode.
Just super quick follow-up. Isn't the reference to intuition here in a way meant to, or at least saving him from the worry that it's a logical contradiction? At least he portrays it. We can't intuit it, but it's not how it goes together, but it's not the concepts that get us in trouble. And also I thought with real possibility, I don't have this in my head right now, but that's the limit. We can't settle issues of real possibility for the noumenal, but only for the phenomenal world.
Well, we can't settle a lot of them. We can settle some of them. So, for example, we know that freedom, we're supposed to have Kant is insistent that freedom is actual and therefore must be really possible, right? So that's the fact about the noumenal world. When the first edition of the Critique of Pure Reason comes out, there's reason to think, I think Carl is right about this, I don't know if he still believes it, but he once defended the view. There's reason to think that Kant was committed in 1781 to the idea that there is a theoretical proof of the reality of absolute freedom. Later on, he says, no, practical proof. But in both cases, it's supposed to ground knowledge of real possibility of some fact concerning the noumenal world. So we don't have much, but we're supposed to have some.